In February, we were tapped by RMA to conduct the ALLL training, and we were in Philadelphia doing that. And there was a gentleman, one of your contemporaries, Graham, who said, "I don't understand why you asked me and not Graham Dyer to come and speak about this." He's formerly with the OCC. He is a brilliant man. He is a wonderful speaker, and he is very good looking. So for that and many other reasons, we are glad to have Graham Dyer.
Oh man, checks in the mail. Actually, I guess that's the second time I've been called eye candy today, so thanks very much, Dalton. See you guys at the pool later. Oh man, by the way, I want to thank Bart for his comments earlier. Great presentation. I'm upset with Dalton for having me follow it. Bart, like all former regulators, has a wonderful personality. Unfortunately, I am an accountant. That's a joke. Well, that's not a joke. I am an accountant. Would you like another accounting joke? Yes, I thought so. An accountant and his two friends go into a bar. That's the joke. Okay. All right, let's have fun here. So my song, I'm just going to dump these on the floor. I hope that's not too distracting. My song was Walk This Way by Aerosmith and Run DMC, which I happen to love, but I have never understood the lyrics. And so I thought maybe I can incorporate the lyrics into this presentation. And I unfortunately can't, because it's the most inappropriate song I think I've ever read. But anyway, there's Steven Tyler, who's got a really awesome sequin jumpsuit that Dorsey promised to buy me that I can wear for Halloween next year out in the hallway, so check it out. Fabulous hotel. All right, there is my stuff. As Dalton mentioned, I was formerly with the OCC. I did a 2-year fellowship with the Office of the Chief Accountant with the OCC, and like Bart said, I don't purport to represent their views in any way. I do have some insight as to their thinking on some of the subjects. I'm of course happy to share that, but I'll make it clear, in case there are any people for the OCC here, I am not purporting to represent the OCC's views. This is a slide that says I'm not purporting to represent Grant Thornton's views, because depending on how this goes, I guess I may or may not be employed there next week. So, okay, now that the fun is over, let's talk about the objective of today's presentation, which is this. So we want to describe, basically this is a session where we're going to lay out the incurred loss model versus the current expected loss model, FASB's proposed model, affectionately called the CECL model. So our goal here today is to, is that showing up there? No, not really. Describe the current incurred loss model just briefly so that we've got a baseline there in order to contrast it with the current expected credit loss model, the FASB proposed model. And then once we've got sort of a baseline of the understanding of the proposed model, we want to walk through some of the data that we think is probably necessary in order to compute current expected credit losses, and like Bart mentioned, to have a good process that will withstand both regulatory scrutiny and auditor scrutiny. And then finally, we'll walk through a very brief case study of one way in which you might use that data to calculate the current expected credit loss model. It's been, this model's, as we'll talk about some of the history, but this has been years of bickering and debate and hand-wringing. And we do think at the end of this year that the final model will come out, which will, over the adoption period, result in more bickering and hand-wringing and arguing. So with that, I think one point we want to get across today is that, as Dalton mentioned earlier, there is no solution in a box. We would be highly skeptical of anyone who would say, this is exactly how you do it. So our goal here is not to tell you exactly how you do it. Our goal here is to give you the tools to understand the model, to understand what it is it's driving at so that you can implement it in your unique circumstance, in your bank, on your loans, with your systems. The old Chinese proverb comes to mind: if you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. If you teach a man to fish, you feed him for life, right? So I thought, in the interest of us all becoming good friends, I would share a picture from my most recent fishing trip. That was kind of funny, right? All right, we'll keep going here. Okay. So the incurred loss model, our friendly FAS 5, FAS 114 model. Okay. So the guiding concept to the incurred loss model, right, is that it is losses incurred in the portfolio as of the measurement date that have not been given recognition via charge-off. So you might call those unknown losses, right? They're losses that have perhaps been specifically identified to a loan, but we haven't confirmed the loss, so we haven't charged it off. So to some degree, there's an uncertainty about the amount of loss that's in our FAS 5, FAS 114 model, right? And the notion of incurred here is that the event that will lead to the charge-off has happened. So, to give you an example, this presentation may not be off to the greatest start, and Dorsey, who's my boss, might decide, you know what, Graham, that wasn't good. We no longer need your services, and I could be unemployed tomorrow, in which case my cards are sitting on table 6, and I'd appreciate a phone call. Thank you for the uncomfortable laughter. It was an uncomfortable joke. So my losing my job is the loss event. I've got enough savings to manage my mortgage payment for probably 15 or 20 days. Just kidding. Let's for the sake of the example, assume that I've got enough savings to pay my loan for 3 months. So I've lost my job, but the loan has no symptoms of loss to the bank until 3 months when I start missing payments or slow paying or partial paying. And it's only at that point that the bank has some idea that something has gone wrong. And then, 6 months later, it reaches 180 days past due, we charge the sucker off, right? So the idea here is that the loss was incurred when I lost my job, even though we're not able to measure it. What isn't appropriate under the current model is to anticipate a loss, which is what CECL will bring in. So the example we often use there is that if the hurricane is 2 miles offshore, you probably can't book the loss today until it hits. Tomorrow, you would be able to. Or tomorrow, I guess, once the CECL model is enacted. We've got the 3 components here of today's allowance. Just real quickly to go over it, we've got FAS 5, which is non-individualized, non-individual reviewed loans, right? I know we have a lot of credit people, and there are a lot of loan review people in the room, so this is the stuff, this is the other stuff. FAS 114, that's the result of our credit review. Those are individually reviewed loans where we use either discounted expected cash flows or fair value of either the loan itself or the underlying collateral to measure loss exposure. And then SOP 03-3, which is our purchase credit impaired loans, what they're commonly called, right? These are loans that you bought with deteriorated credit quality, and there's a whole separate methodology for estimating the allowance on those loans for deterioration after acquisition. So that is the allowance model today. And this slide is illustrating, I think, a broader concept. So this notion of an incurred loss model is not just the allowance model for loans or for debt instruments. It is, in fact, the contingent loss model for all loss contingencies under current GAAP. So whether that is legal matters or debt securities or allowance for doubtful accounts, loans, insurance losses, like obsolescence reserve on inventory, it doesn't matter what it is. If it's a contingent loss, the way we measure it today, the way we account for it today, is that that loss isn't recognized until the loss event is incurred. Under the CECL model, there's going to be a fundamental shift. So you will, today, where we have one model for all contingent losses, we will have 2 models. One for financial instruments that are classified as debt securities, or debt instruments, so debt securities, loans, and leases, and then everything else will still be under the incurred model. So what I don't want anyone to go away with is thinking that the fundamental GAAP model has changed. It's only changed for specific assets. And that's a real fundamental shift in GAAP, and you can see why it's taken so long, right? We'll talk a little bit about why this decision was made, but I did want to make it clear again that the model that's going to be applied to debt securities is going to be fundamentally different from that which was applied in the past, and that will be applied to other similar liabilities on the balance sheet. Okay? All right. Okay, so this is a cool graphic that illustrates what the allowance is today. So if you think about the y-axis being the lender's knowledge or confidence in the loss, and the x-axis being the passage of time, we can conceptualize the allowance here graphically. So the orange area are charge-offs. The orange area are known losses that have been charged off, whereas the purple area are incurred losses up to the balance sheet date. So this reporting date right here, that's our balance sheet date. The gray area is losses that are resultant from loss events that are expected to be occurred after our reporting date. So today, we have this bright line right here where, again, if the hurricane is a couple miles offshore, we don't recognize that loss today, right? Even though it's expected, even though we know historically over time we lose so much on the life of our mortgage portfolio, we're not supposed to estimate those losses until incurred, right? I'm assuming this is everyone's clear, everyone understands this and loves this model, is friends with it. I loved the term that was used earlier by my table mate, the allowance artist. Everyone is familiar with painting this picture, right? Okay. So to break that out a little bit, sort of practically how it looks for the left-brained of us, like myself, accountants, here it is expressed as sort of a mathematical formula. So the way we tend to think of the allowance, at least the FASB portion of it, which tends to be the large portion, right? We start with historical losses. We adjust those for qualitative adjustment factors to say what were the conditions present over the period over which we gathered our historical loss information, and what are the conditions present today. So if we had unemployment was at some elevated level over the period over which we accumulated our loss history, and it's lower today, we might have examiners, plug your ears, negative qualitative factor adjustment. It is conceptually possible. That again was kind of a joke, but it's okay that no one laughed because it's not really funny, because no one seems to allow negative Q factor adjustments, although it's clearly provided for in GAAP. From there, we have this idea of a loss discovery period, which is basically the idea of how long does it take to go from the incurrence of the loss event to charge off, right? So if that takes, say, let's take my example earlier where it took me 3 months to exhibit non-payment when I get fired tomorrow. You have and in 6 months to get to 180 days past due and charged off, that's a 9-month loss discovery period. So if we have a historical loss number which is annualized, in that example, we would multiply that by 3/4, right? 9 months out of 12 months. So if you use an annualized rate when you only have a 9-month loss discovery period, you're actually reserving for losses that have already been charged off, which is sort of an odd concept. Whereas we have some loan portfolios that exhibit much longer loss discovery periods. Some commercial portfolios may have 18, 24, even longer periods, in which case if you only have an annualized charge-off rate, you haven't actually captured all of the incurred losses. So this is an important notion under the current model that we think deeply about the loss discovery period. That's not the thrust of this presentation. I know Dorsey's going to be talking about ways that you can use allowance data to better manage your loan portfolio, and this is one of the key components in that. So stay tuned for that, because that's an interesting discussion. And then finally, we multiply that combined rate by loan type, and we end up with our GVA, right? We end up with our FAS 5 allowance. This is pretty familiar stuff, right? And I think the great fear of banks today is that we have been doing this for so long, and we've got our processes down, we've been collecting all this data, and we're going to have to throw it all out. And, I'm from Dallas, and the First National Bank of Bowlegs, Texas, is going to have to produce a PD LGD model. I think that's the fear. And I think what we want to do today is tell you that we actually think that this data is going to continue to be very useful under the CECL model. Now, we may have to have greater access to that data. We may have to look at it in different ways, and we may need some tools that help us do that. So maybe just looking at charge-offs over loan balance in the year when they were charged off, that might not be quite as meaningful. But knowing what balances are and what the experiences of those losses, of those loans via losses over time, which is what this captures, is going to be really relevant. So the good news is we think you've got the right data in-house. It's just, are we able to manipulate it and massage it in different ways in order to produce a result that, that will help us comply with the new CECL model? Okay, so that was the happy slide. That was the good news slide. Now we're moving into some of the bad news slides. And the reason that, unlike Bart's dynamic presentation that had him walking amongst everyone, I chose to stand behind the dais is this is usually the portion of the presentation when things get thrown at me. And I like the protection, frankly. Sorry, the jokes get worse as the presentation goes on. A little history on CECL. So I thought this cartoon was funny. We've got the stock market going in the bridge overhead, and it says faulty gusset plate, and this gusset plate says subprime mortgages that are holding the bridge up, right? Kind of funny. So that's a transition into this, in the result of the financial crisis, the IASB and the FASB, so that's the International Accounting Standards Board, and the U.S. standard setter, the FASB, put together this group called the Financial Crisis Advisory Group, or rolls off your tongue as FCAG. That wasn't intended to be a joke, actually. I got more laughs than the last one. All right. July 2009, they convened in 2008. In July 2009, they released a report. Take note of that. That's July 2009. That is almost 5 years ago. And the result of this was they said, hey, here's what we think the allowance ought to do. We think it didn't quite give investors enough information, enough of the information they wanted to be able to see the risk building in order to make institutions and frankly, non-banks. We always talk about this in terms of banks and not in terms of other systemically important financial services companies like GE Capital and whatnot. But I think, they're looking to them as well. They said what the allowance should do is it should be a single, what they called measurement approach. Because remember, we had a single model. Incurred loss is one model, but it was implemented in a lot of different ways for different types of instruments. And the FCAG said that's hard for users to understand. It's hard to think about, other than temporary impairment on securities versus FAS 5, FAS 114 on loans versus, say, SOP or 799-20 for retained beneficial interest. You just have lots of different implementations of the same model. It's hard to understand. They said, we simplify that. They said you ought to incorporate forward-looking information. And they didn't say lifetime, but they kind of hinted at it. And then they said, and we recommend international convergence. So speaking of, well, we'll cover these one at a time. And like I said, 5 years, FASB and IASB have been working on this joint project. And we're not quite finished yet. Okay, so single impairment measurement approach. This would apply to all entities. This is where we get into the techie part of it. So if you're a credit person, try to follow along. If you're an accountant, all right, I know I've got your attention. It applies to financial assets that are debt instruments and are not measured at fair value through net income. So if you've got a debt instrument that you carry in your trading book, well, it's probably outlawed under Volcker anyway, but in theory, if you had one, it wouldn't be captured under this model. This is only for held to maturity or what will be known as amortized cost method investments, and then fair value through other comprehensive income, old available for sale criteria. Let's see, so financial assets are pretty obvious, right? Cash, evidence of ownership, et cetera. A debt instrument is exactly what it sounds like. It's the contractual right to receive cash flows or a contractual obligation to pay cash flows, right? And then again, measured at basically available for sale or held to maturity. There is a practical expedient, and the practical expedient is this. It says if you carry something through fair value through other comprehensive income, so available for sale securities, if the fair value is greater than amortized cost, you don't have to apply CECL. And that kind of makes intuitive sense, but that wasn't clear on the initial guidance. So if fair value is greater than cost, you have an unrealized gain, you don't have to put some sort of measurement of loss up. If fair value is less than cost, so you have an underwater security, you do apply CECL, but the amount of the reserve is limited to the amount that the investment is underwater. Okay? Because initially there was a lot of hand-wringing over, as Bart mentioned, you need to put, there is no threshold, so you need to put up something on every debt instrument. People are going, you got to put up something on treasuries? And I think when people raised that, I think that finally got the regulators' attention. They said, yeah, treasuries, we're not okay with putting up losses on that. We've already got the credit guys crawling down our throat downgrading us. We don't need all the banks putting up reserves too. So, okay, so graphically, CECL is built, as we talked about earlier, kind of on the same data foundation as the incurred loss model. So, today, we have historical losses adjusted to today. That's kind of this upper band. And here, we're going to take historical losses and adjust for a reasonable and supportable forecast period. So I don't quite know how long that is, and that probably depends on your bank and your portfolio. For some things, we've got some good forecasts information available. Some things we don't. So reasonable and supportable is kind of the key here. It's not just, you've got to be able to support your forecast period. At the same time, I don't think what's going to fly with your, I would assume with the regulators, I can certainly attest for your auditors, saying, well, we can't reasonably or supportively forecast anything, so we're stopping today. I think that would be bad, just a hint. You're probably going to have something. In fact, I'm really looking forward to later, we've got a couple of college students that have done a really fantastic presentation on some sources of forecast information, and I read it before we got to the conference, really excited to hear what they have to say. But I think, here we've got 2 undergraduate college students who found some really good sources of forecast information, so I think there's an expectation that our seasoned, highly experienced bankers will be able to do the same. So, and if not, I'm sure these guys don't have jobs yet and would love to be hired at really high salaries. You guys owe me later, all right? Okay, so forward-looking, so we covered single impairment measurement approach, which was one of the FKI's recommendations. Here, we're going to cover the next one, which was incorporating forward-looking information. So the first part of it here is that what CECL would require is that at every period, you would recognize an allowance for credit losses, okay? And what you are measuring is shortfalls in expected cash flows. So you're going to measure expected future cash flow and expected credit losses, and that should add up to total contractual cash flow. That's the idea, right? So you can sort of back into it. You can say, what are my expected losses? Or you can say, what are my future expected cash flows? And then subtract from that total expected cash flows and find the difference. So there's kind of 2 ways to get there. But that's in a nutshell what it's trying to measure. Forward-looking information, we've talked about reasonable, supportable forecasts. One thing it says, it must consider the time value of money. The FASB has, we're talking about this idea that we can use our historical losses. The FASB has basically said that as a practical expedient, historical loss information will count as considering time value of money. There's sort of a, I think everyone scratches their head when they hear that, but it's sort of a practical expedient allowed for banks, which I think is a good thing. Make it a little easier to implement. We talked earlier about expected losses is the difference between contractual cash flows required and expected contractual cash flows. And Bart touched on this earlier. I want to hit it in a little more detail. When it talks about expected losses, it's not most likely, it's not worst case, and it's not best case. It is this economic concept of expected. So sort of like a probability weighted average of all potential outcomes. And I think people took a step back when they first saw that and go, well, how in the world do I do that? So a couple of key things. One is it said you have to have at least 2 outcomes, one of which has an expectation of loss and one of which doesn't. So you don't have to do modeling for all possible outcomes and have this huge econometric model. You don't need that. The other thing is loss rate methodologies inherently consider lots and lots and lots of different outcomes. Because if you've got a pool of loans, you've seen those loans perform and result in payment and non-payment and low losses and high levels of loss given default. So a loss rate methodology already accomplished, a loss rate based methodology already accomplishes this. So don't get hung up on this, because a loss rate methodology already kind of gets you there. Okay? All right. Are we tracking? I'm getting some sleepy eyes. Maybe we had too many people by the band last night. Okay, like we mentioned, transparency on PCI loans. Just real quickly, if anyone here has PCI loans, just know that the accounting for that is going to change. Today, there's non-parallel treatment between changes in expectations of cash flow. If you have an expectation that cash flows are going to improve, you recognize that prospectively through yield today. Whereas if you have an expectation that cash flows will get worse, you recognize that via a provision to the allowance. And actually, the way it's going to work under the proposed model is that everything will flow through the allowance. So if you have an expectation of increased credit loss or increased cash flow, you will release from the allowance. You'll get an immediate impact. There are some historians of this standard who think that's inviting bad behavior, but nonetheless, it appears to be sticking. As for international convergence, that didn't happen. FASB took their ball and went home. And the IASB has a completely separate model that's really quite different from this. So one of the main goals of FCAG, which was international convergence, has not been met, unfortunately. Okay, real quickly, a couple of practice issues. There's some questions around the scoping of PCI accounting. So if you have PCI loans or you're an active loan purchaser, you'll want to pay attention to what falls into that scope and what doesn't. Happy to talk about that. You can come find me. TDRs, they have kept the TDR designation despite the protest of, I'm sure, everyone in this room and even the regulators who don't think it's all that meaningful, but investors seem to like it, so they've kept it. Non-accrual status is kind of up in the air, and I think there's a chance it may get cut, which is a problem. Bart mentioned earlier that non-accrual is a concept that applies to regulated entities, but it doesn't apply to non-regulated entities that have the same assets, and that's unfair. And so I think there was a lot of hope that it would get into the standard, but I think there's a chance it might not. And then inclusion of traditional regulatory concepts. Charge-off and collateral dependent are defined in the standards. So that will move that partly out of just regulatory guidance and into actual U.S. GAAP, which is good. Okay, transitioning to current expected credit losses. So we revisit our fancy slide here where we talked about earlier charge-offs, unknown losses incurred through the reporting date, and now we get to bring in this gray box, which is losses that haven't yet been incurred but are reasonably expected, and we know something about that forecast period. It's a forecast period we can support, right? Okay. So this is sort of built on the idea of past events, current conditions, reasonable and supportable forecasts. So let's talk about past events. We think it's important that you have data on a pretty individualized loan level. That's probably historical loss rates by loan type and loss patterns by loan type, which may require something like a vintage analysis. And I know that may sound daunting, but that's not, you have the data. It's just how do you mine it and do the modeling. Usually the data is not the problem, it's the people and time to do the modeling that's required. The other thing we've talked about here is correlations between key economic metrics and then an economic metric or loss rate lag. So one of the questions that we often get is, well, how do I turn a forecast into an adjustment to a historical loss rate, right? Well, I think a common way that we expect it to be approached is to look back over time and model changes in key rates to loss experience. So let's say we're looking at our mortgage pool and we've decided that one of the key drivers we'd like to examine is unemployment in a geographical area. So the Fed puts out a ton of data on unemployment rates, right? So we track the movement of unemployment versus loss experience, okay? simple enough, right? Take some time, but not all that complicated. The idea of the lag is this, that a change in unemployment today doesn't result in a loss today, typically, right? I lose my job, it takes some time for that to start showing up in loss data, right? So there might be, for example, a 6-month delay. When unemployment first rises, that we see loss rates rise along with it. So don't just necessarily look period over period, but try to say, well, how long do I think, try to estimate that lag too, right? Like how long does that take? And that's pretty important when you're forecasting future changes in, say, unemployment. Well, when do I expect that to start affecting my loans, right? So that concept's important too. Again, not a terribly difficult thing. It just takes data, access to that data, and time to do it. Okay, data on a loan level of what I'm calling air quotes duration data. And this is basically loss patterns. So when do we see losses occurring, not just relative to changes in economic factors, but just in the portfolio itself? Do they tend to be front-loaded and then slowly over time? Is there a period of, say, like HELOCs, where they perform like clockwork until the reset date happens, we've got a payment shock, and they all go bad all at once? What's the loss pattern for this particular type of loan? We need to know that as well. Bless you. Okay, so we've kind of talked about this, but step 1 is identify the relevant metrics by time for these reasonable supportable forecasts. Step 2 is identify the economic forecasts that are available to you, and step 3 is translate that to loss information, kind of like we just talked about. Cool? Okay. So if you're like me and you like simple formulas, because complex formulas are hard, I'm maybe the only accountant willing to admit that he's bad at math. I'm really terrible at math, but I'm a heck of an accountant, so don't let me undersell you here. Okay, so this looks pretty similar, at least in concept, to our old methodology under FAS 5, right? Historical loss experience by type, that sounds familiar, where previously we had adjustments to take it from the period over which we accumulated our losses to today. Now we take it from the period over which we accumulated our losses to today, and then over our reasonable and supportable period, right? So it's kind of one extra step in this box. And then instead of our loss discovery period, I'm adding what I'm calling a duration factor. And I don't want you to think about it like necessarily a number that you're going to multiply by. It's more like a concept. It's more, where am I in this portfolio's life, and what is my loss experience like over the life of that portfolio? So let's say you have a portfolio that's in runoff mode. You might say, you know what, we're really not originating new auto credits or whatever it is, and we think most of our losses are behind us. So maybe you have your duration factor is a downward pushing idea, that it's a reduction over your historical loss experience because you're in runoff mode. However, let's say you are in ramp-up mode and you're really starting to land in a particular area. You might need to say, well, we think most of the losses are actually in front of us, so our historical loss experience we're going to really amplify because we think the duration idea, where we are in the life and where the losses are mostly in front of us. So again, this is not necessarily a multiplier. As Bart mentioned, and I will echo, when this first came out, we had lots of people say, well, if I've got historical losses over an annualized period today, let's say I've got 2 years of charge-offs in my allowance, but I think this portfolio lasts for 5 years, do I need to multiply it by 2.5 times? That is really wrong. So don't do that. There's lots of reasons why that's wrong, and I'm happy to talk about the concept as to why that's wrong, but don't do that. If you think that's right, I promise the good news is it's not right, and the impact will be much less than that. We even had big data groups that are really kind of almost bank trade associations call us and say, we think this is the impact. This is when I was at the OCC, by the way. So I can say at least at the time the regulators thought this, and we said, no, this is not the case. I promise it's not going to be a multiplier like just by the weighted average remaining life. So I promise that's not it. There's another piece of good news for today. Okay, case study. And I think I've got about 7 minutes, maybe less than that. 7 minutes. I'm getting the nod from Dalton. All right. To go through a case study, which is probably what you've all been waiting for. What I want to point out here is we think this is one way in which you might implement the model, and it's consistent with the examples given in the standard, but this is certainly not the only way you can do it. So this isn't necessarily gospel. Like I said before, anybody who says, I've got the magic bullet, this is the one right way to do it, is selling you a bill of goods. You shouldn't trust that person. It takes an individualized approach to your portfolio, kind of like we talked about for all the variables today. Okay. That being said, I think the concepts here can be applied to any portfolio in any bank. Okay. So this is what I'm calling an open pool cohort approach. So each quarter, you would look back over some loss accumulation period, which is a coined term that I coined, so don't look for it anywhere. It's my idea. I say that because this is not, we're off the beaten path of official guidance here. This is Graham Gap, so treat it as such. So the idea of a loss accumulation period is look back to all the loans outstanding at the beginning of that period, grouped by some relevant risk characteristics. So commonly loan type, risk grade, et cetera, right? So let's talk about past CRE loans will be our example. And group those into cohorts. So we're going to look at the past CRE cohort as of some period past. And I think I've got in my example 16 quarters. So we're going to look 4 years back. What loans existed 4 years back and what losses have they experienced over the following 4 years, okay? We're going to accumulate those charge-offs over this loss accumulation period, and then each quarter we're going to do this, and we're going to average those results to come up with some measure of historical expected loss, okay? So let's say our loss pattern looks like this for our pass-rated CRE loans. So we've got kind of no losses at the front, and then they kind of go up, and then, you know, a year and a half in, 2 years in, we experience most of the losses we experience pretty quick down, and then we have very little once they're pretty seasoned, okay? So in this example, you know, and some portfolios can have really long lives, so you sort of have to set a practical loss accumulation period. You think about mortgages, you know, say 7 years is kind of a typical. You think about prepayments and whatnot, 30 years. You don't need to look back to 1984 to start doing this, although in theory you could. And over time, as you do this, you should start to build true lifetime experience as you see whole cohorts roll off, right? Okay. So you look back over that period, you capture your losses, and then each quarter you roll this calculation forward. And you take so this represents a loss accumulation period. And so let's say you capture 10 loss accumulation periods in your average. And that becomes your baseline historical loss factor. It basically says, on average, I think my lifetime expected losses are X, okay? This is, by the way, basically FASB example number 1 in their examples that follow the proposed standard. So I know this is hard to think about and we don't have a lot of time, but I kind of wanted to open it up. And then from there, you would add your adjustments, which is kind of what this goes through. There's nothing magic here. This is just adding. And I made all these numbers up completely, so don't try to figure out the math. They're just me typing in. And then you would do it for, again, different types of loans add up to your deal. So I wanted to leave time for questions. All right. Oh, man, please. The question was, is it not like a PDLGD model? It is not a PDLGD methodology. It's a historical loss-based methodology. And we think this fully complies with, in fact, it's kind of built off a FASB example. And I know that I spoke with some folks that I used to work with over at the OCC, and I know that they are working on some guidance to help banks transition an historical loss method into a CECL model. So at least speaking for them, I think there is an expectation that banks will be able to leverage historical loss data through, you know, appropriate, well-documented analysis to be able to get to an expected loss type model. It's a great question, Pam. Thank you. Follow up. Okay, so the question is, what if you are utilizing a PD-LGD model? How would you apply that to a CECL type model? You know, I think I need to think about it at a little greater length, but I think one of the main things to think about is PDs have a time period embedded in them, right? You might use it's common under the Basel methodology, Basel II advanced approach, to use like a 1-year probability default, and you might need to extend that to some reasonable and supportable period, I would think. And also, of course, there's always judgmental factors built into PD-LGD models. There's kind of a management fudge factor in there as well. So I think those concepts, I think the concepts about how do you track metrics to your adjustments are still applicable. But I think the thing I would probably focus on is what period do I use for my probability default? Do you go all the way to a lifetime PD? I don't know, maybe. That's a great question, thank you. Are there others? In the back, please.
When you talk about the loss accumulation period,
Yes.
are you saying, so you make an estimate based on what you think that cohort of loans, the life of that one, the average life of that cohort is?
Okay, so the question was, if I think I heard it was the loss accumulation period, do you make an estimate of the life of that cohort? Yeah, I think it probably requires maybe a one-time study looking back a sufficiently long period to see what the roll-off has been like to establish that time period, and then you probably use that time period. So if I go back here, I might have done some study. I might have gone back 10 years and said to see a whole cohort roll off all the way, and then say, okay, that's kind of the period where the losses happen, so I'm going to use that as my loss accumulation period based on a study that really looked at what was the actual experience. So that's something you'd have to support, but that's a great question. Yes, ma'am.
So when we sort of start building this loss accumulation period, how do you factor like the refi market, everything else is looking right now?
Yep. Yeah, so the question was, how do you factor in things like if you got a mortgage portfolio where you've refied 60% of it or something over a couple of years, how does that impact it? That's a great question, and I think I would continue to use I think the best approach to any loss rate methodology is to have a consistent approach, and if you have something like that, I think I would adjust it through basically my qualitative factors, is say, why do I not expect my future performance to be like my past performance, and make an argument there? I think where banks get in real trouble is when they start adjusting their historical period. Losses have been bad, so we're only going to look at 1 year, whereas traditionally we looked at 3 years, and you start getting whipsawed. And once you do those movements, it's pretty hard to go back to a stable baseline. So I think it makes sense to have kind of a consistent approach, and then think about those adjustments in these sort of qualitative adjustment factors. Now, how mechanically you do that, it's a great question. That's a really great question. I don't have an answer for you right now, but business cards are on the table. Love to talk to you about it. All right, that's my sales pitch. I'm really good at that, as you can tell. Dalton, I think I'm out of time. Yeah, okay, guys, thank you very much. I'll be around for the rest of the day if you want to talk about something. Thanks.